Hi everyone, I'm Olivia,
I'm Joey.
and welcome back to another episode of our podcast, Nothing in My Brain.
Yeah, and today we're going to be talking about addiction. So we're going to start off with like what it is and what it isn't. So it like before there was like a scientific like explanation of like what addiction was. It was associated with like a lack of willpower, and like it was considered like a moral failure. But in honesty, like it's actually like a physiological disease that like takes away like your control. So like your response to it isn't like more of like a choice. It's more of like a reflex.
And there's certain symptoms that characterize addiction, like one of them being loss of control, another one being craving, and then there's also like continuous use, even though you know that there are negative consequences.
Yeah, so the reason why like this like sort of like such a reflex is that like because addiction like changes like your brain structure, so it rewires it to make you associate like something with positive like spike of dopamine and stuff like that.
And like it's important to note that there are two types of addictions. One of them is substance addiction. So this is just like substance use, and this is like mainly drugs and alcohol. And then there's also behavioral addiction, which is more like binge eating, gaming, shopping addiction, stuff like that.
Yeah, it's like important to like distinguish like the difference between like drug addictions and like social media addiction, like your phone addiction or like food addiction. So like for like a drug addiction, like chemically like directly changes like your dopamine like levels, whereas like phones or cheeseburgers, like they just like associate like the process of getting it with like dopamine like levels. So like it's a lot more like serious with like drugs and stuff like that. So it's like really important to like distinguish like how like harder like kicking like an addiction to drugs is compared to like other stuff like cheeseburgers and phones.
And there's also like an experiment on it, right?
The rat park experiment.
Yeah. Can you elaborate?
Yeah. Okay, so like this is just like to get rid of like whatever like initial like stereotypes that you have with like drugs. So, like what you think like drugs are, like it's not really like what it is. So like in the rat park experiment, it was like conducted by a man named Bruce Alexander. So basically, you put like a rat inside like a bear cage with like two water balls, and one is like just water, right? And the other one is like drug laced and like in the water. And so like your initial thought is like, yeah, like of course like the rat would like keep like using like the drug laced like water, because like that's like what drug does, like it keeps you like addicted, right? And that's true, right? Like the rat did use like the drug water bottle like constantly. And then like I think like Bruce Alexander like thought like maybe like the drugs like isn't doing like what we think it does. So like he created like a different like cage where like he put like more rats inside, like, and he put like a rat park, so it's basically like a fun like theme park for like the rats. And so like he put like the same like two water balls in there, and he found that like the rats didn't use the drug water ball, it used like just like the normal water ball. And so like what this teaches us is that like we're just like replacing like stimulations from like drugs with like stimulations from like other people. So like everyone craves like connections, and like people who just like use drugs, like they're just like replacing human connection and human like stimulations with drugs.
Yeah, so this is why like when you're alone, you're more likely to use your phone or just like game. But when you're with a large group of people, and I know some people do use their phones when they're like eating lunch or something, but usually you guys are talking and then the phones are not out. So
yeah, because like every single like second, like what's stopping us from like using alcohol and drugs, right? Like everyone has access to it, everyone can like use it any stage of time, but like the reason why we don't use it is because like something's keeping us back, which is like we have connections with like our friends and family to maintain, and like we have like a purpose in life that we have to like strive towards. But like when you don't have any of that, like you have to like use something to like keep yourself stimulated, which is like why like if you're locked in like a wide room with like nothing at all, like you need something, right? So you're just like creating stuff like for your brain to like engage with. And so like that's what like drugs are able to achieve.
But yeah, that's like a large part of why people doom scroll or why people like snack, because they're bored basically, and they want to cure their boredom. But I think you like also brought up a good point about how accessible everything is. For example, like alcohol, you know, like alcohol addiction is probably the most prevalent addiction in society, because it's, first of all, it's socially acceptable, and also you can get it literally everywhere. It's all around, whereas like illegal drugs are harder to obtain. And so it's kind of like weird how alcohol is so normalized, especially even though it has ethanol. And so there's obviously a lot of harmful consequences to your brain, and you know, you're hungover, you're drunk and stuff like that. And yet people still use alcohol to like celebrate. And then you see it all the time in the media as well. For example, like in dramas, whenever the character is sad, they always go to drink. They drink to celebrate any occasion. So
yeah, and it's like hard to like distinguish like what constitutes addiction with alcohol, right? So like it's like how many is too much. So it's like easier to like deny that you have like an alcohol addiction because like drinking is like so normalized where it's like that you can say that that's not like a lot. Like people do it every single time like there's like a wedding or stuff like that, and so like it's easier to like not recognize that you have a problem with alcohol, and because like people accept it, like they're like more easier to like say that no, you're fine. Like
yeah. Wait, and like another thing about alcohol is that it has a long history, because like
prohibition.
No, like people were fermenting like fruits and like rice like a long time ago, like all throughout the world, and so it's just like something that's been passed down. Yeah. Okay, so more about kind of like the biological aspects of addiction. So for example, we're talking about substance abuse. When a psychoactive drug enters your body, you obviously just get this large surge of dopamine. And dopamine is the neurotransmitter that's responsible for movement and sometimes euphoria. But this large surge of dopamine is very unnatural. So it'll give you like very high euphoria. And it's mainly like affecting your midbrain. Like I think there was an experiment where like there were rats and then there was also cocaine. And then basically when the rats were taking cocaine, it was stimulating the midbrain basically. And then so our midbrain basically controls our survival functions. And so the more drugs we get, basically our survival hierarchy, you know, like Maslow's hierarchy, it kind of gets messed up. And we put the drugs first. Like we need the drug for survival, basically. And and so the prefrontal cortex isn't activated as much because the midbrain is activated first, so it's hard to make judgments saying like so that's why like people have a loss of control.
So like basically what you're saying is that like dopamine like reduces like a receptive to like stuff that like stimulates your dopamine. So like now like you're more like leaning towards like a natural like triggers of dopamine like compared to natural triggers of dopamine.
So basically like addiction causes dopamine to flood like the brain 10 times more than natural causes do.
And so you need like more and more because like your tolerance is like built up, right? So like for example like sometimes like just like reading a book, like when you're like little, like we read a book and like we get dopamine, like now we have to like scroll on TikTok for like an hour just to like get like that same like rush.
I mean, this also has to do with like reading stamina. Now people can't read like long text. So people have to like read the short text, and you know how like there's Subway Surfers. People be putting the Subway Surfers.
They need like so many stuff. Once if you like listen to music, you have to watch a show, you have to like be like reading. There's like so many things that you need to like be going on at once in order to like feel like the same like rush of like dopamine,
exactly.
Right?
It's like overstimulation. You have to be multitasking. That's why so many people multitask.
I want to be honest. Like when I'm studying for like tests, like I'm like putting on music and like putting like the videos. I'm like reading like text. Like there's like just like so much going on for me to like be able to like focus. So like I think like in today's culture, like people like messed up because like a couple of years ago, like all they did was like read a book, like go for a walk, and they could like achieve like the dopamine. Like now you need to like listen to music while walking. You've got to like it's crazy.
Yeah, I definitely get that. And so like another thing about tolerance is that your brain, of course, is adapting to these high levels of dopamine. So as a consequence, the brain reduces its dopamine receptors and production. So this is why like your body kind of crashes afterwards. Like if you take cocaine or something, your body crashes afterwards because the brain is depleted of like these neurotransmitters. And so each time you have to take more and more of the thing. And then like high dopamine levels is also really bad for other brain regions that are like related to memory or decision making. That's why you feel like the harmful effects right afterward.
Yeah, and all of like those like aspects of like your behavior, like decision making, memory and judgment, like it's all like disrupted.
Yeah. And like another thing is that the brain not only releases dopamine, but it releases glutamate. And so glutamate is a neurotransmitter that's responsible for memory. And so the more glutamate, you remember this experience more vividly. So that's telling your brain, oh, I really liked that experience. Let's do it again.
Yeah. So like basically what dopamine does is like it like makes like your brain like prioritize like what is important, right? So like what produces the most dopamine. So in some cases it's like drugs. So like your brain prioritizes like the intake of drugs because it's like that's what gives me the most like surge of dopamine. And so like it teaches like your brain to like follow the steps that lead to that surge, right?
And so it also, these like dopamine neurotransmitters also project into your amygdala, which is responsible for emotion. So you're going to be like, wow, I really liked that. You know, you feel that feeling of pleasure. And then it's also sent to the nucleus accumbens. And this is like part of like the basal ganglia, which is more of like motor functions. So this will like tell you, for example, if you're binge eating, it'll tell you, oh, eat the piece of cake. It'll like control the motor function of that. I think we can talk a little bit about like the types of psychoactive drugs because there's like a lot of different drugs out there. So one of them is like depressants. So these drugs reduce your neural activity. And then some examples would be like alcohol, like when you slur your words, it's like a slow neural processing. And then there's also opioids, which have a depressant effect basically, and these offer pain relief and euphoria because they're endorphin agonists. So they're very highly addicting. And then there's also stimulants, which excites neural activity, and these are like used to feel more alert. So caffeine, you know. I know a lot of people have a caffeine addiction.
Look at me.
Okay, but like this is why people drink like caffeine to feel more awake. And then there's also things like cocaine and ecstasy. Yeah. And then there's also hallucinogens, which evoke hallucinations and like you kind of feel like disembodiment. And so examples would be like marijuana, which offers like relaxation, and LSD, which is like a powerful drug.
Okay, wait, so there's like this thing like during the Vietnam War, right? Like like there were like the veterans who like take like a amount of like drugs while they were like on duty.
Yeah.
And so like when they came back, like there was like an experiment where like they would monitor those veterans to see like how they responded like when they came back to society and like how like they would deal with like their intense like drug use in the war. But the thing was like those like veterans like they just like stopped completely. Like they didn't like they weren't like addicted to like drugs after they were done with the war. Like they just like came back and they like reunited with like their families.
Back.
And they like just like formed like the connections they had with your family and just like continued on with their normal life. So it just like comes with like addiction isn't really like it's I think it's like isn't a choice, but like it's sort of like people go on addictions for like a reason, right? So like when they can like be able to like adjust back to society and they can like have like the connections that they need, then like they don't have like a purpose to like take drugs anymore.
Oh yeah, I think I get what you're saying. Addiction's definitely linked to like mental health.
Yeah.
Kind of like mental health disorders, you know? Like people with depression often have like depression and like substance abuse and anxiety and other like mental health disorders. They like kind of work together. And like some other factors that kind of affect why we take drugs would be like peer pressure too, you know, especially in teens. Apparently, like according to this study, 70% of teens who like smoke cigarettes say it's because like their friends are smoking it or because they see other people smoking it, so they want to like join in.
Yeah, it's like just like the need to like fit in and stuff like that, right? Like
yeah. And there's also like apparently genetics also play a role in substance abuse disorder. Like it's responsible for 40 to like 60% of heritability in like substance use disorder. And it's been in like a bunch of family and twin studies. So I thought that was interesting.
Wait, why is it genetically like affected though?
I'm not sure. I didn't really read that deep into it, but it kind of has something to do with something like biological, how like certain cells or like receptors are more vulnerable to like alcohol, or it changes the way they react to alcohol.
Yeah. Okay, so now we're gonna talk about like how like you would like maybe like respond to like if there's like people in your life that face like addiction. So like I think like your first like response would be to like punish them, right? Like you just like take away the stimulant, you take away the drugs, you take away your phones, you take away like food from them. But that's like I don't think that's necessarily like the correct response to it. So I'm just gonna talk about like what happened in like Portugal with like the drug like use, right? So like at some point in time, I think like about like 20 or so years ago, like Portugal had like a very severe like drug problem, right? And so like I think the president like they formed like a board that was like specifically like responsible for trying to help like the drug crisis in Portugal. And so what they came up with was like actually decriminalizing drugs instead of like giving them more punishment. And what happened was that they legalized all drugs, and like instead of like putting like using the money to like put those people in like prison and like feed them and stuff like that, they used the money to like help them like get more jobs and help them like readjust to society and help them like form like social connections. And what this is that what happened was that like the amount of like drug use in Portugal actually decreased by like 50% 15 years later. And the reason why this is because like previously we talked about how we're just replacing stimuli with like your friends and your family with like drugs, you know, it's just like connections, right? And so instead of like letting them have connections with like drugs, like using drugs as like a form of like stimuli, they're just like helping them readjust to society and helping them form bonds with other people instead of like using drugs. And so it gave them like a purpose in life.
And like there's also like in America as well, like incarcerated people are also like being given like jobs or like just working so they can kind of be reincorporated back into society so they don't turn back on drugs and stuff like that. And kind of like what you were saying, how they go to rehabilitation instead of like being arrested, it also comes with a lot of self-awareness. So in order to like curb addiction and stuff, you have to be self-aware. You have to know why you want to quit, why it is bad for you as well.
Yeah, I mean, like obviously like, you have to recognize that there is a problem, right? Like you have to like want to fix in the first place, right? But like I think that like the reason like why there's such like a disconnect between like friends and family is that like there's such like a negative stereotypes on like what drugs is. So it's like there's a problem with like that person, that's why they're turning to drugs. But the actual thing is that like they feel like such a big disconnect with like society and like their friends and family that they have nothing else to turn to, and so they just like lean towards drugs.
I think that's also why it's really important to teach kids like when they're young healthy like stress and coping skills so they don't turn on to things like drugs and stuff. So like I think that's really important. And it's also they have to like find other things to distract themselves, like kind of what you were saying, they need other stimulations. And so another like it's important to realize that like recovery from addiction isn't like linear. It's obviously gonna be like small steps, you know, like people who want to quit smoking, they can't just like quit in a day.
Yeah, I think there's like 12 steps to like rehabilitation, right? Like first step, like there's like due to the apologies. Never mind, let's just like move on.
Wait, do you know them all?
No. But like there are steps, yeah.
But like you know how like people chew gum or like certain stuff instead of like.
But what I found interesting was like you said that they like distract themselves from like drugs and stuff like that, like what they were like addicted to. But like I think that you can be like addicted to like social relationships too, right? Like you can form like a toxic relationship with like people where like instead of depending on like drugs, you know, instead of like being addicted to drugs, you're addicted to that one person. So like
toxic relationships.
Toxic, they start being like so clingy that like it's just like another form of addiction at that point, right? So I think it's like I mean obviously you gotta form healthy relationships, you gotta know like that like you gotta have like some like form of like independence where you can be like healthily by yourself.
Yes.
And then you can just like use like those like social interactions and like social like bonds as like a sort of like indulging in like stimulation, stuff like that.
Yeah, I definitely agree. I think usually you need like a change in environment. You want a safe environment, and you also like want a supportive environment that you can kind of fall back upon, which is like sometimes really hard to access for some people. And that's why like support groups are like important too, you know, like other people going through the same thing, you see them and then you guys can kind of inspire each other.
Yeah, that's sort of like social connection, right? So like the reason why like support groups are like so important in like rehabilitation is because you find this group of people who understands like what you're going through, and you can like sort of like have bonds with them, right? So you can like hang out with them instead of like hanging out with like drugs.
Yeah,
right?
that's true.
So we're gonna talk about like how like you should respond to like addicts or like people who like are addicted to like social media cheeseburgers or like shopping. So like what you should do is just like be there for them basically. Like you gotta provide them with like a source of like connection, so like you can be a source of like bonding and like stimulation for them instead of like have leaving them to have to like turn to other forms of like stimulations, like
yeah, like we should definitely support them and not like shun them away, because that would just make it worse.
Yeah.
There's also like, if for like heavy substance abuse disorders, there's also like certain types of medication that's kind of like the first line to kind of get them off. And there's also like different types of behavioral therapy, like cognitive behavioral therapy, that people can access.
Oh yeah, and it's like this like recent like trend on like social media where it's like the dopamine detox, right? You know about that?
No.
It's like when you're addicted to your phone and stuff like that. Like what you can do is just like keep like your phones and like your computers like away, and you can just like go like read a book and stuff like that. So that's basically like, because like phones are like a lot more like stimulating than like a book, right?
Yeah.
So like you basically like lowering like your tolerance to it. So like instead of like needing like these like huge like surges of dopamine, you just like need like a little, right? So instead of like turning to like phones and like computers, like you're just like using books as your only source of like dopamine like stimulation. So now you're like slowly like lowering your tolerance for using it for like a couple of like weeks and months.
Well, yeah, I also know there were like people who went on like digital like detoxes during like the summer or something. Like they'll spend a week somewhere and then they won't be able to use their phones at all. And that was actually kind of what I did, because not really, but basically I went to like this camp place or whatever, and they didn't have Wi-Fi, so I couldn't use my phone. Obviously I was like heartbroken during the first few days.
You came back a changed person?
Yeah, it was only for like a few days though, that one. It was like pretty short, but I couldn't use my phone at all. I had no Wi-Fi, and I was like obviously craving my phone 24/7, and I was like complaining, but at the same time I was becoming like more aware of my surroundings. I was finding fun, and I could just like talk to more people more freely, basically.
Yeah, so like how long did it take for you to relapse back in your addiction?
Once I got back on my phone.
Okay. Wait, yeah. So I think like a big part of that is like putting like your phone away, right? So like I think like something that happens like with our brain is when they see like your phone, they associate that with like dopamine levels, right? So like your brain like learns to like reach for your phone like as a reflex, right? So you have like no control, you just like reach for your phone like instinctively. But if you're like you put your phone like away and like your brain like doesn't like see your phone at all, like, and they don't like really think about it that often, it's like harder to like when you like reach for your phone and stuff like that, right? So,
yeah,
like,
like, maybe I should lock mine in a box.
Yeah, or like shove it under like the bed or something like that. Yeah, that's like a good way to like your phone. Yeah.
And there's like a lot of other really common addictions. One of them would be like, you know, a lot of people have like eating addictions. Yeah. And this kind of like eating, well, it's part of like eating disorders.
Yeah,
you know, like binge eating addiction, which I think is like, it's like characterized by, it has something to do with like your hypothalamus and like satiety, or like satiation levels and stuff like that. But basically when you're feeling like depressed or something, or you're feeling
stressed.
a lot of negative emotions, you basically like eat those emotions away.
I mean, I definitely felt that during like finals week.
Yeah.
So like instead of like starting, like I would just like go to the kitchen and like eat. You know
Stress eating.
Yeah.
Like when you can't find other sources of joy, like people like stress eat, which I definitely get.
Yeah. And I definitely do.
Yeah. So I definitely get that. There's also like gaming addiction. Yeah. You know, there's a lot of iPad kids nowadays.
Yeah.
And like when you go to a restaurant and stuff, you see people like little kids on their phones instead of like talking to their parents.
Yeah. So it comes with like the lack of connection again, right? Like instead of like talking with their parents, like they just like choose to like use their phones, like avoid being bored or stuff like that, right? So so I think like if you see iPad kids, if you have an iPad kid, just like make sure to like talk to them and stuff like that. You know, make sure that they have connections.
Exactly. Okay, guys, thank you for listening. That's going to be it for today's episode on addiction.
Yeah, don't forget to follow our podcast and tune in next time.
Bye-bye.
Bye.